"Mister, if they come, please hide my mom." The boy's voice cracked as he spoke, his small hands gripping the edge of the old rancher's coat. His eyes were wide, not just scared, but desperate, like someone who had seen too much for his age. The rancher froze, his weathered face tightening as the words sank in. For a moment, only the wind moved, carrying the faint smell of rain and dust across the empty fields. The rancher bent down, his rough hands resting gently on the boy's trembling shoulders. "Slow down, son," he said quietly. "Who's coming?" But the boy just shook his head, tears forming at the corners of his eyes. He looked back toward the dirt road behind him, empty for now, but the fear in his eyes said that wouldn't last long. The boy's clothes were dirty, his shoes half torn, and his voice was thin like he hadn't eaten in days. Yet his words carried something stronger than hunger or exhaustion. They carried urgency. The kind that tells you danger isn't far away. "Please," he whispered again, "they'll hurt her if they find us." The rancher's heart sank. He didn't know the boy or his mother, but something inside him stirred that deep instinct to protect, the same one he'd felt long ago when his own children were small. He stood tall, the shadow of his wide hat falling across his face. "Over my dead body," he said, the words slow and heavy, like iron being set in place. The boy looked up at him, unsure if he'd heard right, but the rancher's expression didn't change. His eyes were calm, steady, and full of a kind of promise that didn't need explaining. Outside, the sky was turning dark. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the sound of a car engine echoed faintly down the road. The rancher placed a hand on the boy's shoulder again. "Go get your mom," he said quietly. "You're safe here." And for the first time the boy's breathing eased just a little. He turned and ran toward the hill, disappearing into the rain. The rancher stepped to his porch, eyes fixed on the horizon. Whoever was coming, they'd have to go through him first. The storm rolled in slow, the kind that doesn't rush but makes the air feel heavy, like the sky itself is holding its breath. Out in the distance, the horizon was painted in shades of gray and orange, the last bit of sunlight fighting to stay alive behind the dark clouds. The ranch sat quietly in the middle of miles and miles of open land. No neighbors close enough to hear a shout, no cars passing by unless they meant to be there. It was the kind of place where secrets could hide, and danger could sneak up without warning. The old rancher had lived there most of his life. His name was Walter, though no one called him that anymore. Around town, folks just said Walt, a man of few words, strong hands, and a back bent from years of working the land. His home was simple, a small wooden house, a creaky front porch, a stable, and a barn that smelled of hay and oil. He wasn't rich, not even close, but everything he owned was built by his own hands, and that made it worth more than money. The land was his world, quiet, predictable, steady. He woke with the sun, worked until it fell again, and spent his evenings with nothing but the sound of crickets and the old radio humming in the corner. That was his peace. That was before the boy showed up. He stood on the porch now, his eyes scanning the dirt road. It stretched out straight and lonely, cutting through the open fields like a scar. Somewhere beyond those fields, the boy and his mother were running. He didn't know from what, but he could feel it. The kind of danger that doesn't leave footprints, but you still know it's close. Inside the house, a single lamp glowed in the corner. Its light flickered softly against the walls lined with old photos. A wife long gone, children grown and far away. Those faces had been his reason once, but life has a way of taking what you love and leaving you with what you can handle. For Walt, that was the land and the silence. Until tonight, that had been enough. He walked back into the kitchen, his boots thudding against the wooden floor. The smell of coffee hung in the air, though it had gone cold hours ago. He picked up his hat from the table and brushed the dust off it, more out of habit than need. Something about the boy's face, the fear in his eyes, wouldn't leave his mind. He'd seen fear before, in animals cornered by coyotes, in men broken by loss. But this was different. This was the fear of someone protecting someone else. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Each second seemed louder than the last. Then faintly came the sound of footsteps. Small ones. Walt turned toward the door. The boy appeared again, holding his mother's hand. She looked exhausted, her hair tangled, her clothes soaked from the rain that had started to fall. There was something sharp in her eyes, though, a strength beneath the fatigue. She didn't speak right away, only looked at Walt like she was deciding whether to trust him or keep running. "You the one he told to hide us?" she asked quietly, her voice rough but steady. Walt nodded. "That's right." She hesitated, glancing toward the road behind her. "They're close," she said. "Please, we won't stay long." He didn't ask who they were. The fear in her voice said enough. He simply stepped aside and motioned for them to come in. "You'll stay as long as you need," he said. Inside, the warmth hit them first. The small fire he'd lit earlier still burned in the hearth, its light dancing across the room. The boy went straight to it, holding his hands out to the heat. The woman stood by the door, still looking uneasy. "Name's Walt," he said, breaking the silence. "You too hungry?" She nodded slowly. "We haven't eaten since yesterday." He opened a cabinet, pulled out a few cans, and set them on the counter. "It ain't much, but it'll fill you." The boy's stomach growled at the sight, and for the first time a hint of a smile flickered across his face. Walt noticed, and something softened in him. As they ate, the rain grew heavier. It beat against the windows like impatient fingers. Every now and then, thunder rolled, low and long, like a warning. The woman flinched at every sound outside, her eyes darting toward the window each time a flash of light broke the dark. "They ain't gonna find you here," Walt said calmly, not looking up from his plate. She looked at him, uncertain. "You don't even know who's after us." "Don't need to," he said. "All I need to know is you're scared, and they're wrong for making you that way." For a moment, she didn't answer. She just looked at him like she wasn't sure if she should believe those words. People don't often help without wanting something in return, but there was something about Walt, something simple, something honest. Then the boy spoke, his voice small but clear. "They took my dad," he said quietly. "He tried to stop them. They said we'd be next if we didn't stay quiet." The woman closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "They don't stop, mister," she whispered. "Not until they get what they want." Walt's jaw tightened. He didn't ask for more. Some truths didn't need details. The pain in their faces told enough. Outside, the rain slowed, but the night grew darker. In the distance, the sound of an engine broke the quiet. One car, maybe more. Walt stood and went to the window. Headlights flashed faintly down the road, moving closer. He turned to them, his voice steady but low. "You two get to the barn," he said. "There's a space behind the hay bales. Stay quiet no matter what you hear." The boy froze. "Are they here?" Walt didn't answer. He just grabbed his coat from the wall, opened the door, and stepped onto the porch. The rain had stopped, but the air was colder now, the kind of cold that comes before something bad. He looked out at the road again. The headlights were closer. The engine's growl echoed across the empty land. He placed his hat on his head and straightened his shoulders. Inside the barn, the boy held his mother's hand tight. They could hear the rumble outside, the sound of gravel crunching under tires. Walt stood tall, waiting. Whatever was coming down that road wasn't welcome. And if they thought they could walk onto his land and take a scared mother and her boy, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Rain dripped from the edges of the porch roof, steady and slow, like a ticking clock. Walt stood there, watching the headlights creep closer along the dirt road. The engine's growl grew louder, heavier, echoing through the wet night. Inside the barn, the boy and his mother crouched behind stacks of hay. Every sound outside magnified: the slam of a truck door, the crunch of boots on gravel, the low voices cutting through the wind. The boy's name was Ethan. He held his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. His heart thudded so hard it hurt. Through a small crack in the barn wall, he saw shadows move, men with flashlights, slow and deliberate. They weren't searching for just anyone. They were hunting. Back on the porch, Walt raised his lantern. The light threw long shapes across the yard, revealing 3 men in dark coats, faces hidden under wide hats. The one in front smiled like he'd been expecting him. "Evening, old man," he said. His voice was smooth, practiced. "We're looking for a woman and a boy. Pass this way maybe." Walt didn't flinch. "Can't say I've seen anyone," he replied evenly. His tone was dry calm. Years of ranch life had taught him that fear never helped. The man took a few steps closer, his boots sinking in the mud. "Funny," he said. "Tracks lead right up your road." "Cows wander sometimes," Walt said, his eyes steady. "Rain makes tracks look different." The man smirked. "You're a terrible liar, mister." Walt met his gaze, his jaw tightening just enough to make his words carry weight. "And you're on my land without permission." For a moment the world went still. The men looked at each other, unsure how far to push it. The leader tilted his head, then smiled again, though his eyes stayed cold. "We just want to talk to them," he said softly. "No one needs to get hurt." Walt's hand rested on the porch rail, near the rifle leaning against it. He didn't raise it, not yet, but his message was clear. "If they were here," he said slowly, "they'd be under my roof. And if you think about crossing that line, you'll wish you hadn't." Inside the barn, Ethan buried his face against his mother's coat, trying not to breathe too loud. His mother pressed a finger to her lips, her body trembling. She could hear every word, every pause. She'd been running from these men for weeks, sleeping in fields, hiding in old gas stations, always one step ahead. But she was tired, too tired. If not for the boy, she would have given up days ago. Outside, the lead man gave a slow nod. "You're brave, old-timer," he said, "but brave gets people killed." "Maybe," Walt said, his voice rough as gravel, "but I sleep fine knowing I did the right thing." Rain started again, heavier this time. The thunder returned, low and rolling. For a moment the men hesitated. One of them shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward the truck. The leader sighed, then stepped back. "You see them," he said. "You tell them we're coming." "I'll tell them," Walt said. "But you won't like what comes next." They stared at each other, two men who understood that some fights weren't about winning. Then, without another word, the strangers turned back to their truck. The engine roared to life, tires throwing mud as they drove off into the darkness. Walt stood there long after the sound faded, lantern light flickering against the rain. His heart was steady, but his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what he'd just done. He turned toward the barn, his boots heavy in the wet earth. Inside, Ethan's mother looked up when the door creaked open. Her face was pale, eyes wide with worry. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "For now," Walt said. "But they'll be back." She nodded, her voice breaking. "You shouldn't have helped us. They'll hurt you too." Walt set down his lantern, the light warming the dusty walls. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I've seen enough bad men in my life to know one thing: if good folks stop helping each other, the world turns rotten fast." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to understand why a stranger would risk everything for them. But Walt didn't explain further. He didn't need to. The truth was simple. He couldn't look at that scared boy and do nothing. Ethan crawled closer, his small voice shaking. "Mister, are we safe?" Walt knelt down beside him, the boards creaking under his knees. "You're safe tonight, son," he said, "and tomorrow we'll figure something out." The boy nodded, leaning into his mother's side. Walt stood again, pulling a wool blanket from a nearby hook and tossing it toward them. "Get some rest," he said. "You'll need it." He walked back toward the door and looked out one last time. The rain had washed away the tire tracks, but not the feeling in his gut. Trouble wasn't gone. It was waiting, circling, deciding when to strike again. He blew out the lantern and stepped outside, the cool wind brushing against his face. Somewhere out there, those men were talking, planning their next move. He didn't know how long he could keep the mother and boy hidden, but one thing was certain: he'd made a promise. And a promise, to a man like Walt, was carved deeper than any scar. Morning came quiet and gray, the kind of morning where the air feels heavy after a night of storms. The ground was still damp, and mist clung low across the open fields. Walt stepped outside, coffee steaming in his hand, his boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. The world looked peaceful again, but he knew better. Peace was just the space between storms. He glanced toward the barn. The doors were still shut tight. No movement. He'd told the mother and the boy to rest, but he hadn't slept a minute. All night he'd sat by the window, watching the road, listening for engines. He'd seen too many signs of the kind of men who came looking for people like them, the kind who didn't bother with laws, only orders. Inside the barn, Ethan stirred awake first. His mother still slept beside him, one arm around him protectively. He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and for a brief second he forgot where he was. Then he heard the distant creak of the ranch door and remembered everything. The fear came back like a cold rush. Walt pushed open the barn door and stepped inside. The light from outside spilled across the floor, cutting through the dust that floated in the air. "Morning," he said softly. "Got food on the table if you're hungry." The boy nodded, glancing at his mother. She sat up slowly, blinking against the light. "We didn't mean to trouble you," she said, her voice hoarse. "You didn't," Walt replied simply. "You needed help. That's all that matters." They followed him back to the house. The warmth of the stove and the smell of eggs and bread filled the room. For a while no one spoke. They just ate in silence. Outside, the sky began to clear, patches of blue showing through the gray. Ethan watched Walt carefully, as if studying him. There was something steady about the old man, something solid that made him feel safe. "Were you scared last night?" the boy asked quietly. Walt looked up from his plate. "Scared," he thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Maybe a little, but being scared don't mean you run. Sometimes it means you're still standing, even when you want to run." The boy nodded, pretending to understand, though he was still too young to fully grasp it. His mother gave Walt a small, grateful smile. "You didn't have to do what you did," she said. "They could have hurt you." "I've been hurt before," Walt said. "This ain't new." There was a pause, then she said, "You don't even know who we are." "Doesn't matter," he replied. "You needed a place to hide. That's enough." She lowered her eyes, the weight of everything pressing on her. "We can't stay here long, they'll come back, they always do." "I figured that," Walt said, "but you'll stay till I figure out how to get you clear of this." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Why are you helping us?" Walt stared out the window for a long moment before answering. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it. I never forgot." Ethan looked between them, sensing there was more to that story, but the silence said it wasn't the time to ask. The wind shifted outside, rattling the screen door. Walt's gaze followed it, sharp and distant. He stood, setting his mug down. "I've got fences to check," he said. "Stay inside. If anyone comes up the road, don't move till I get back." The woman reached for his arm. "Please be careful." He gave a short nod. "Always am." As he stepped out into the open fields, his eyes scanned the horizon. The land stretched out endlessly, but even from a distance, he could spot tire tracks pressed into the soft earth. The men had stopped by the edge of his property during the night. He could see where they turned off the road, circled around, then left. They weren't done. They were waiting. He followed the tracks until they vanished into the brush, then knelt down, pressing his hand against the ground. Still soft, still recent. He stood and looked toward the ridge, a good place for someone to watch from. Back at the house, Ethan stood by the window, peeking through the curtain. His mother was cleaning the dishes, though her eyes were far away. "Mom," he whispered, "do you think we'll ever stop running?" She froze, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know, baby," she said softly, "but we'll keep trying." Walt returned not long after, boots covered in mud, face set in quiet thought. He walked straight to the table, picked up a map from a drawer and spread it open. "There's a train station 50 miles east," he said. "Small town. Hardly anyone goes there anymore. I know a man who works freight. Owes me a favor." The woman frowned. "You'd help us get there," Walt nodded. "If you leave tonight, you might stay ahead of 'em." She hesitated. "And you?" "I'll be fine," he said. "I'll make sure they don't follow you." That answer didn't sit easy with her. "They'll come after you," she said. He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Then they'll find out what happens when you push an old man too far." Ethan smiled faintly, like he believed Walt could take on the whole world. And in that moment, maybe he could. They spent the rest of the afternoon gathering supplies: food, a blanket, a small gas can. The mother folded what little clothes they had left, her hands moving fast, her eyes scanning the window every few seconds. Walt saddled his horse and checked his rifle twice. When the sun began to sink, the air turned golden and quiet. The fields shimmered like fire in the fading light. It should have been beautiful, but it only made the silence heavier. The mother and boy stood by the porch steps, ready to leave. Walt handed her a small tin of money, the last of his savings. She shook her head. "I can't take this." "Take it," he said firmly. "You'll need it more than I will." Ethan ran up and hugged him without a word. Walt froze for a second, then placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder. "You listen to your mama," he said. "And don't ever stop running toward something good." The mother's eyes shimmered. "Thank you," she whispered. He tipped his hat slightly. "Don't thank me yet." As they walked toward the edge of the property, the wind picked up again. Walt watched until they disappeared beyond the hill. Then he turned back toward the house, his steps slow but certain. The night was coming, and he knew the men would be too. He'd made his choice. He'd stand his ground. If they came for that boy's mother, they'd have to go through him first, over his dead body. Night settled on the land like a heavy blanket, thick and still. The wind had died down, and the only sound left was the soft creak of the barn door as it swayed on its hinges. Walt sat on the porch, a lantern glowing beside him, the light flickering against his lined face. His rifle lay across his lap, his hand resting on it, not tight but ready. He had that look about him, a man who knew what was coming and had already made peace with it. The sky was clear now, the storm long gone. Stars scattered above him, cold and sharp, watching quietly as the world held its breath. Out there in the dark, somewhere beyond the ridge, engines hummed, faint at first, then louder, closer. Walt didn't move. He just listened. The sound of tires grinding on gravel reached his ears, followed by the crunch of boots. The same voices from before, low, rough, confident. They were back, 3 of them again, maybe more. Headlights swept across the front yard, slicing through the dark. The leader stepped out first, the same slick smile stretched across his face. "Evening again," he said, his tone casual, like they were old friends dropping by. "We didn't finish our talk." Walt stood slowly, setting the lantern aside. "Didn't realize we had more to say." The man chuckled, taking a few steps forward. "You know why we're here, old man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Walt's voice was calm, but it carried weight. "You boys don't seem to understand. You're not welcome here." The man's grin faded. "We can do this easy, or we can do it loud." He gestured to one of the trucks. The engine revved, lights flaring brighter. "Tell me where they are." Walt didn't answer. He looked past them, out at the horizon, then back to the man. "They're gone," he said flatly, "and if you're smart, you'll be gone too." The leader's jaw tightened. "Gone where?" "Farther than you'll ever find," Walt said. One of the men behind him spat in the dirt. "He's lying," he muttered. The leader sighed, pulling a revolver from his coat. The metal gleamed under the truck lights. "Last chance," he said, raising it slowly. "Tell me where they are." Walt stared at the gun, then at the man holding it. His voice stayed level, steady as stone. "You really want to point that at me, on my land?" The man sneered. "Your land doesn't mean a thing tonight." Walt's hand didn't shake. He lifted his rifle, resting it against his shoulder with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. "Over my dead body," he said quietly. The men froze. The words weren't loud, but they hit like thunder. There was something in his tone that made even the night pause. The leader laughed nervously, lowering his gun just an inch. "You think you can take us all, old man?" Walt didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence said everything. Then the tension snapped. The man swung his arm, the gun flashing up again. Walt fired first. The crack echoed through the valley, sharp and final. The leader stumbled back, his weapon clattering to the ground. The others dove behind the truck, shouting. Another shot rang out, splintering wood from the porch railing. Walt dropped to one knee, reloading without hurry. Inside the house, glass shattered as a bullet tore through the window. Walt stayed low, moving along the side of the porch. He knew the land better than any of them. He'd fixed every fence post, every gate, every corner of this ground. It wasn't just a place, it was part of him. He moved like he was part of the darkness, quiet and sure. The men fired blindly, the flashes of their guns lighting up their faces in brief, angry bursts. Walt took another shot. One of them went down with a scream. The others cursed, ducking behind the truck. The air smelled of smoke and wet earth. The fire from the muzzle flashes flickered across the mud. Walt could hear one of the men breathing hard, trying to reload. He stepped out from behind a post, rifle raised. "You boys picked the wrong house," he said. They fired again, but their shots were wild. Walt didn't miss. Another man dropped, the rest scrambling to the truck, desperate to get out. The leader, clutching his bleeding arm, shouted, "You don't know who you're dealing with." Walt lowered his rifle just a little. "Don't need to," he said. "I know what kind of men you are." The truck engine roared as the last two survivors jumped inside. Tires spun, flinging mud across the yard as they tore down the road. The sound faded into the distance until all that was left was the whisper of the wind. Walt stood still, chest rising and falling slowly. Smoke curled from the barrel of his rifle. The lantern still burned faintly on the porch, its light soft against the broken boards. He looked down at the man he'd shot first, still, eyes open, face pale. Walt's expression didn't change. He wasn't proud. He wasn't sorry. He was just tired. He turned his gaze toward the hill where the boy and his mother had disappeared hours earlier. The moonlight touched the field, silver and quiet. They were far away by now, he hoped. Far enough not to hear the gunfire. Far enough to keep running. He walked back to the porch, his boots heavy with mud. The night air felt colder now. He sat down on the step, setting the rifle beside him, and leaned back against the wall. His breath came slow, the adrenaline fading. He stared out into the dark, into the silence he had fought to keep. The crickets started again, one by one, until their steady rhythm filled the air. It was as if the land itself was returning to calm, pretending nothing had happened. But Walt knew different. The world doesn't forget nights like this. The earth remembers. He looked down at his shaking hands and wiped them on his jeans. Then he picked up the rifle again and checked the chamber. Old habits never die. A faint light flickered on the horizon, maybe dawn coming early, maybe something else. Walt didn't move. He just kept watch because that's what men like him did. He'd drawn a line in the dirt and held it. And until the sun came up, he wasn't leaving that porch for anything. The morning light crept slowly across the valley, pale and quiet, touching the edges of the old ranch first, the fence posts, the roof, the muddy trail still marked by last night's chaos. Smoke drifted faintly from the porch, where Walt sat, motionless, the rifle resting across his knees. The wind had calmed. The land looked peaceful again, but that peace felt fragile, like glass that could shatter with one wrong sound. Walt's eyes were tired but open. He hadn't moved much since the shooting stopped. The lantern beside him had burned out hours ago, and the chill of dawn had settled into his bones. His coat was torn, his hands streaked with dirt, but his grip on the rifle never loosened. He'd seen nights like this before, nights where doing the right thing left you with blood on the ground and a heavy quiet that followed you for years. A crow called somewhere far off, breaking the silence. The sound echoed, lonely and sharp. Walt shifted slightly, wincing at the ache in his shoulder. There was a scrape there, a line of blood from a stray bullet, but he hadn't even noticed it last night. Pain didn't matter much when you were too busy staying alive. He stood slowly, his joints stiff, and walked down the steps. The dirt under his boots was dark and wet, still soaked from the rain and what had followed. One of the trucks lay tilted in the ditch, a door hanging open. The others were gone. The men who'd come were gone too, except for the one lying near the fence, the one who hadn't made it. Walt stopped near him, staring for a moment, then pulled an old tarp from the barn and covered the body. No words, just the quiet act of a man who'd done what he had to do. The sun climbed higher, washing the land in gold. The same fields that had felt endless and empty now looked alive again, stretching out toward the horizon. Walt stood there for a long time, his gaze fixed on the dirt road leading east. That was the direction the mother and her boy had taken. He imagined them still walking, the boy holding his mother's hand, maybe looking back just once before the world swallowed them up. He walked to the barn and pushed the door open. Inside, everything was as they'd left it, the blanket still folded near the hay, a tin cup half full of water, a single small shoe print in the dust. He reached down, brushing his fingers over it. It was so light, so small. A reminder of why he'd done all this. Walt sat down on a hay bale, the barn quiet except for the sound of pigeons shifting above. His mind drifted back to years ago, to his own children running across this same land, the laughter, the noise, the life that used to fill this place. His daughter had been about the boy's age when she moved away, chasing something bigger than the ranch could offer. His wife had passed not long after. Since then, the land had been his only company. Until last night, it had been enough. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. A letter. He'd written it years ago but never sent it to his daughter, telling her he was proud, telling her he hoped she'd found happiness. He stared at the faded ink for a while, then tucked it back into his pocket. Maybe someday, if the world gave him another quiet night, he'd finish it. The hours passed slowly. He cleaned his rifle, patched the hole in the porch, poured himself a cup of coffee that tasted like rust and smoke. He moved carefully, every action deliberate. A man doesn't rush after a night like that, not out of fear, but out of respect for the silence that follows. By noon, a truck appeared on the horizon. Not black like the others, this one was old and dusty, painted a dull blue. Walt tensed for a second, then relaxed when he recognized the sound. It was Sheriff Carter, his friend of 40 years, the only lawman left in these parts who still believed in doing things the old way. The sheriff climbed out, his boots crunching against the dirt. "Heard shots last night," he said. "Figured it was you." Walt gave a short nod. "Wasn't looking for trouble." "You never are," Carter said, looking around. His eyes landed on the covered body near the fence. He sighed. "Guess trouble found you anyway." "Seems that way," Walt said. The sheriff stepped closer. "You want to tell me what happened?" "Not much to tell," Walt said. "A woman and her boy needed help. Some men didn't like that." Carter studied him, his jaw tightening. "They gone now, far as I can tell." The sheriff nodded slowly. "You always did have a thing for standing between people and bad news." Walt shrugged. "Someone's gotta do it." Carter looked at him for a long moment before saying softly, "You did right, Walt." Walt didn't answer. He just looked out toward the hills again. "Right don't feel like much some days," he said. The sheriff didn't argue. He just tipped his hat and said he'd handle the cleanup. Walt didn't watch him work. He just turned back toward the porch, sat down, and stared out at the open land. The sky was clear now, not a single cloud. By late afternoon, the sheriff was gone, the trucks were gone, and the ranch was quiet again. Walt sat there until the shadows stretched long across the yard. The air was cool, soft, the kind of evening that made the world feel new again. Somewhere far away, a train whistle echoed through the valley, faint but clear. Walt listened. It came again, longer this time, rolling across the land like a promise. He pictured the boy and his mother on that train, sitting side by side, eyes half closed, the first bit of safety they'd had in weeks. Maybe they were heading east, maybe farther. It didn't matter. They were free. The sound faded into the distance. Walt took a deep breath, the scent of wet earth and grass filling his lungs. He leaned back, eyes closing for just a moment. For the first time in a long while, the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt earned. He opened his eyes again, the sun dipping low behind the hills, turning everything gold and soft. The day was ending, but the land, his land, was still standing, still strong. He'd kept his word, and that was enough for now.